I sat up late at night a few weeks after the events that took place in January of 2020. I typed it all out over and over again, and no matter how many times I changed the words, their meanings still seemed pretty crazy. I started telling our story in a small way, with small bits on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. My name is Romeo, which was constantly made fun of growing up in Auckland, New Zealand, but was pretty common where I was born. In January of 2020, it had been 3 years since I last set foot in Santa Ana, Philippines. Since I had been back to a place where my name wasn't a punchline from old English literature, 3 years since I'd seen my dad, my cousins, and the side of my family that always felt like a different world from my life in Auckland. The moment I stepped off the bus, the heat wrapped around me like an old embrace, thicker, heavier than I remembered. The smell of the sea mixed with the scent of grilled fish and garlic rice from the roadside stalls, triggering a flood of childhood memories. I barely made it through the front gate of my dad's house before I was tackled by my younger cousins, their laughter ringing through the air as they pulled me inside. My aunts and uncles greeted me with loud exclamations, squeezing my shoulders, commenting on how much weight I'd lost or gained, arguing over which. And my dad, the man who never got emotional, crushed me in a hug that nearly cracked my ribs. That first night, I couldn't eat enough, hug enough, laugh enough. There was too much catching up to do, too many stories to tell. My aunts filled my plate faster than I could eat. My uncle kept my glass full of beer. Adrian, my cousin, sat beside me, grinning as he retold embarrassing stories from our childhood. By the time the night wound down, I was drunk, full, and exhausted in the best way. I lay on a mat in the sala, listening to the muffled voices of my family still chatting in the kitchen, the occasional burst of laughter carrying through the air. I missed this, more than I realized. The next day I met up with Marvin. I hadn't seen him in a long time either, but the moment we were together again, I knew nothing changed between us. Despite the ocean and time between us, I still loved him more than anyone, and I was pretty sure he loved me. That was why I had to meet with him, to tell him what I wanted, and to see where we stood. Most nights, when it was just us away from the family, my cousin Adrian would bring along his American friend, Owen. It was usually the four of us, Owen, Adrian, Marvin, and me. I didn't mind having him around at first, but something about him put me off. Not because he was American, but because he was so cagey about why his parents were in the Philippines. All we knew was that they worked for Philamerica Corp, a science research company with both Filipino and American investors. That wasn't all that strange. After all, I existed in the first place because my mum had been stationed at an American base north of Santa Ana while serving in the New Zealand military. But something about Owen was different. Off. A few weeks later, as I sat up that night, typing this all out over and over again, it all seemed so trivial, like it deserved more. So I turned my phone around and told my story to the camera lens. Of course everyone called me crazy. Dumb. I was relegated to the same category as flat earthers and others who claimed Rome wasn't real. My story really happened, so I never stopped spreading it across social media. A year after the events of January 2020, I wrote and self-published a book. It was widely ignored because of COVID, civil unrest, and everything else that year drowned me out. Rightfully so, as I was just a crazy person who was spreading this crazy, embarrassing lie. But every time I counted my 9 remaining fingers, I knew I had to press on. Finally, I was welcomed to a few speaking engagements, and I used the word welcome loosely, as I was ridiculed and criticized to my face each time I went to one of these coffee shops or bookstores to sign books and tell the story of what happened to us on January 2020. But there were still some who listened. The second weekend I was there, back home with my family and Marvin in 2020, we decided to take my uncle's small fishing boat up the coast of Palawi Island to Engaño Cove. It was something we had done plenty of times before, an easy getaway, far from the noise of Santa Ana, where the beaches were quiet and the air smelled like salt and damp earth. The trip took about an hour, the boat rocking gently on the waves as we followed the jagged coastline. Marvin sat beside me, his arm brushing mine every time the boat hit a small swell. Adrian managed the outboard motor, while Owen sat near the bow, staring out at the horizon, unusually quiet. There was an old military base nearby, but it had been abandoned for years. Phil had taken over the compound, but whatever they were doing, they mostly kept to themselves. They never came to the beach, never bothered the locals. There was no reason to worry about them. Still, every time Adrian brought up Phil to mess with Owen, the guy got weird about it. Not in a defensive way, not even in an annoyed way, like he was afraid of saying too much. They probably just make pharmaceuticals, I said once, trying to get a read on him. Nothing shady about that. Owen laughed dryly, shaking his head. Yeah, sure. That only made me more suspicious. By the time we reached Engaño Cove, the sky was a soft, hazy blue, and the tide was low, revealing smooth stretches of golden sand. We set up our tents a little ways back from the tree line, close enough to hear the waves, but far enough that we wouldn't wake up soaked if the tide shifted in the night. The beach was mostly empty, aside from a few scattered groups of campers, local anglers, backpackers, and some families with kids. It was peaceful. Perfect. We spent the first part of the day hiking in the jungle behind the beach. It wasn't dangerous, no real predators, no cliffs to fall off of. We all knew the area well, but something about it felt different this time. Maybe it was just me, maybe I had gotten too used to city life, but as we moved deeper into the trees, I felt uneasy, like something was watching us. Every now and then, the wind would shift, carrying the scent of damp foliage, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Adrian and Marvin didn't seem to notice anything strange. They laughed, talked about childhood adventures, poked fun at me for how out of shape I was compared to them. But Owen, every so often, he would stop, glance around like he was searching for something. You hear that? I asked him at one point, trying to act casually. He hesitated, then shook his head. No, nothing. But his expression said otherwise. I wasn't crazy. I knew that look. He knew something the rest of us didn't. 2.5 years after the events of January 2020, the world was still crazy, but a bit quieter than it had been during the recent past. Finally, I gained a bit more credibility and was welcome to speak and debate at a university in the UK. Of course, I wasn't good at debate, but at least I was able to tell more of my story and what happened to us on Palawi Island. Back on that weekend, the 4 of us went to the island. The late afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the cove. It felt like a reward after the long, overcast day. The moment we saw it, Marvin was already stripping off his shirt, tossing it near the tents before jogging toward the water. Adrian followed close behind, shouting something about how he was going to outswim all of us. I hesitated for a moment, watching them, then I caught the way Marvin looked over his shoulder at me, his grin lazy, expectant. I wasn't about to miss this. The water was perfect, warm but refreshing, wrapping around us like a second skin. We swam out farther than we probably should have, diving beneath the surface and coming up gasping for air, splashing each other like kids. Marvin was always the strongest swimmer. I'd known that since we were teenagers. He barely needed to try, cutting through the waves with smooth, effortless strokes. I liked watching him like this, in his element, free and unguarded. Owen hung back closer to shore, wading more than swimming, his eyes constantly darting toward the tree line behind the beach. I caught him staring once, his expression tight, his jaw clenched. "What's up with you?" I called over. He blinked, then forced a grin. "Nothing, just thinking." I didn't believe him. We stayed in the water until the sun touched the horizon, the sky shifting from gold to deep orange. The light faded quickly, and as the first stars started pricking through the dark, the air grew cooler. Marvin swam back toward me, his wet hair plastered to his forehead. We should get out before it gets too cold. Together we waded back to shore, shaking the seawater from our hair as we stepped onto the cool sand. By the time the fire was going and dinner was cooking, the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the sea. The flames flickered in the night, casting long shadows behind us. The other campers were scattered across the cove, their own fires glowing dimly in the distance. It was quiet, except for the occasional crackle of burning wood and the steady rhythm of the waves. Owen and Adrian left to get more firewood, their voices fading into the dark jungle. I stayed by the fire, my knees pulled to my chest, watching the way the flames reflected in Marvin's eyes. He looked nervous. He knew what I was about to say, because he wanted to hear it as badly as I needed to say it. But before I could speak, movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. 2 campers sprinted straight through our camp, barely missing the fire. Their breath ragged, their eyes wide with terror. They didn't stop. They didn't even glance back. And then, from the direction they came, a sound split the night. A scream. Then another. And beneath it all, a deep, guttural roar that didn't belong to anything I ever heard before. Marvin and I were on our feet instantly, staring into the darkness where the sound came from. The jungle went silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural, suffocating stillness. Another roar, closer this time. More screams, more people running. A man seated in the university crowd stood up and pointed a finger at me. He chastised me and called me a liar. A few others whispered about how a place of learning as prestigious as this one could allow such a charlatan to take the stage. But a few people came to listen, and I was glad to be able to tell as much of our story as I could. 3 years after the incident of January 2020, I was invited onto a political talk show in the United States. I knew exactly what I signed up for when the lights went down and the cameras were on. I knew what kind of scorn telling my story would bring. On that January night in 2020, Marvin and I didn't move. My whole body was locked in place, my brain struggling to catch up with what was happening. Marvin was beside me, his breath shallow, his fingers twitching at his sides. More campers sprinted past us, their faces twisted with panic, tripping over the sand as they ran toward the docks. Some were screaming, others were too winded to make a sound, only gasping as they fled. Then, silence. Nothing but the distant crash of the waves. For a moment, it was like the world stopped, like we imagined the terror these people expressed. And then it came again, low, guttural, and deafening. The roar sent a shockwave through my chest. It was closer this time, so close that I swore I could feel the weight of it pressing against my ribs. Marvin and I instinctively stepped back, putting the fire between us and the jungle. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what we heard. A trick of the wind? Some kind of animal we didn't recognize? But deep down, I already knew that whatever was out there wasn't normal. Another roar, followed by the sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth. Branches snapping, footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Marvin whispered, "What the hell is that?" I had no answer. And then Adrian and Owen burst from the trees, running straight toward us. Owen's face was twisted in sheer panic. He didn't stop when he reached us. He grabbed my arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "We have to go, now." I yanked my arm free. "What's going on?" Owen shook his head, chest heaving. He looked like he was about to be sick. I turned to Adrian instead, but he was trembling, his face streaked with tears. He tried to say something, but no words came. He stood there, looking past us, back toward the trees, his body caught between running and collapsing. I wanted to believe they were overreacting, that there was some rational explanation for all of this. But then, from behind them, the bushes rustled. A shadow moved, and then it stepped into the firelight. I didn't want to believe my own eyes. It was over 10 feet tall, its body covered in scaly, mottled skin, long arms ending in curved claws, a massive head, its jaws slightly open, revealing rows of serrated teeth. A dinosaur. Not some dino-like creature, but a real one. My brain refused to process it. Every instinct I had screamed at me that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, but then it let out a low growl, eyes locking onto us. It saw us. It wanted us. Then in the present, another panelist on the show was allowed to chime in. He told me how ridiculous my story was, and the host couldn't help but smirk the whole time. I knew how it sounded. I wasn't born on some other planet, so I knew exactly what the whole world thought of me. But I didn't care. I would never waver from the truth, no matter if it took everything from me. I would repeat it over and over, until 4 years later, the tides finally changed. An exposé was released by a French newspaper which blew the cover off a lot of the misdeeds of Philomerica Corp. More eyes were suddenly on me as pictures circulated around the world of genetic test tube monsters, among other things. Finally, I was invited to speak in front of the US Senate. And though I knew this would only bring the number of people who hated me from the hundreds of thousands into the millions, I knew I couldn't relent. I owed my life to this. So I told them how our story ended on that January night in 2020. I wanted to believe I was hallucinating, that somehow the fear and the chaos warped my mind into seeing something that wasn't there. But this wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. The dinosaur, because there was no other word for it, stood motionless for a moment, nostrils flaring as it took in our scent. Its pupils contracted, locking onto us with a terrifying intelligence. And then, without warning, it lunged. "Run!" Owen's voice shattered the paralysis holding me in place. I didn't need to be told twice. My legs were already moving, pushing off the sand as fast as I could. I grabbed Marvin's arm, making sure he was in front of me. Owen was already ahead of us all. Adrian, I realized too late, fell behind. His scream ripped through the night, cutting through the crashing waves and the frantic shouting of other campers. I turned my head in time to see him on the ground, his arms raised in a feeble attempt to defend himself, as the creature's massive foot pinned him down. "No, Adrian!" I skidded to a stop, instinct overriding terror. But before I could move, Owen did something I never expected. He turned. He ran toward Adrian, straight toward the towering beast, fists clenched, his entire body thrumming with desperation. I barely had time to scream his name before he was there, slamming into the dinosaur's flank with everything he had. A man against a monster. It was nothing. It barely even staggered. The creature lifted its head from Adrian and turned its massive jaws toward Owen instead. I think for a split second Owen thought he might have a chance, that maybe he could fight this thing, but he wasn't even close. The dinosaur's head snapped forward faster than I could process, its jaws closing around Owen's torso. There was a sickening crunch, a gurgled sound, then nothing. Owen was gone, just like that. Marvin pulled at me, forcing me to move, but I barely felt it. My body was cold, numb, unable to accept what happened. Somehow Adrian was still alive. I didn't know how, but I wasn't about to question it. Marvin and I grabbed him, yanking him to his feet, and the three of us took off toward the dock. The only place we had a chance, the boat, my uncle's boat, was our only escape. But when we got there, it was gone. The wooden dock jutted into the dark water, completely empty. "No, no, no," Adrian was sobbing, stumbling forward like he could will the boat back into existence. Behind us, the night was filled with chaos. Screams, the crashing of trees, the heavy thud of monstrous footsteps. And not only from the one that took Owen, more were coming. They were everywhere. Marvin clutched his side, breath ragged. "We can't stay here." I forced myself to think, to push past the panic. The boat was gone. That meant we only had one option. We had to go inland. We had to find the road, find people, find anything that could get us off this island. We weren't the only survivors. Others were running too, some in the same direction, others scattering into the trees. For a moment, I thought if we stuck together, we'd be safe. That hope lasted all of 5 minutes. The second attack was worse. This time they came from both sides. I heard the snarl first, the crunch of underbrush, the snap of jaws. Someone screamed. Then Marvin was yanked backward. His own cry of pain shot through me like a bullet. I spun around in time to see the thing's jaws close around his arm, thrashing its head back and forth like a dog with a toy. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself at it, fists slamming into its snout and throat, clawing at its eyes, kicking where its genitals should be, doing anything, everything I could to make it let go. I must have hit something vital because suddenly it released him. Marvin collapsed into my arms, blood soaking his side, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't stop to think. I tore off my shirt, wrapped it around his arm, and pulled him forward. We had to keep moving. I didn't look back. I already knew what I'd see. As expected, half the room thought I was a liar. I already knew, before all of it, what half the world thought of me, but the other half believed me. More so, it was the truth. The truth the four of us lived through. Nothing more or less. That January night in 2020 felt endless, yet somehow, everything happened so fast. I barely had time to process one horror before another was upon us. The creatures hunted relentlessly, their roars echoing through the jungle, cutting through the panicked cries of survivors. Each step forward felt like a battle against exhaustion, against pain, against the overwhelming certainty that we weren't going to make it. But somehow we did. By dawn, what remained of us made it off the island. Some hid through the night, waiting for the chaos to settle before finding boats or making it to the mainland. Others fought their way through, bearing wounds and losses that could never be undone. Marvin lost his arm despite everything the doctors tried to do. The infection set in too deep, the damage beyond repair. He didn't talk much about what happened after that. He barely spoke at all for months. I stayed by his side through it all, but the weight of what we survived sat heavy between us. I only lost a pinky, a ridiculous thing to mourn in the face of everything else. But every time I looked at my hand, at the space where part of me had once been, I thought of Owen, of the look on his face before he charged into death, of the sound his body made when that thing tore him apart. And Adrian made his choice. I should have known from the moment we left that island that he wasn't going to stand with us. He took the money, the promise of silence. He buried what happened beneath a pile of cash and empty reassurances, pretending none of it had been real. But there were too many witnesses, too many stories, too much blood spilled for it all to be erased. I vowed, for Owen, for Marvin, for everyone who never made it home, that I would not let this disappear into the shadows. I told the story, again and again, even when people laughed, when they called me a liar, when they dismissed me as some crazed survivor. Looking for attention? I didn't care. I knew what happened. I knew what they had done, and I would make sure no one ever forgot. Phil-America was raided in the months that followed, shut down in some places, exposed in others. But people like that, organizations like that, never really disappeared. They found new places, new names, new shadows to hide in. I never let my guard down again, because I knew, no matter how much time passed, no matter how much we tried to forget, something would always be out there.